वो समय समय पर जो ऋण लिया था उसको वापस दे रहे थे, लेकिन एक समय आता है कि बहुत सारी कारणों की वजह से वो एक 90 दिन के बाद में वो आगे नहीं जा पाए कि वो अपना ऋण वापस चुका पा रहे हैं। तो इस वजह से उनको एक वो इस श्रेणी में आ जाते हैं कि वो उस कंपनी प्रॉफिट नहीं कमा पा रही है। उसमें फिर पहले आता था कि आप डेब्ट रिकवरी ट्रिब्यूनल में जाएं या फिर सर्फ एसआई एक्ट के अंदर या सीका एक्ट के अंदर जाके। और अगर एक सिर्फ आंकड़ा प्रस्तुत करना चाहूँ तो भारत में किसी भी कंपनी को बंद होने में कम से कम 8 से 10 वर्ष लगते थे। कागजों पर किसी भी कंपनी को बंद होने में 8 से 10 वर्ष लगते थे। और भारत में अगर कोई भी कंपनी बंद हो रही है तो उसके जितने भी लोन वगैरह हैं उनकी रिकवरी रेट सिर्फ 20% थी। तो इस पूरी समस्या को सुलझाने के लिए इंसॉल्वेंसी एंड बैंक्रप्सी कोड को अडॉप्ट किया गया। अब इसके अगर मैं फायदे की बात करूं, चूंकि 4 वर्ष हो चुके हैं इसको इम्प्लीमेंट किए हुए, अगर मैं सिर्फ 2 वर्ष के कार्यकाल की बात करूं जिस समय हमारे फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर अरुण जेटली जी हुआ करते थे, तो उस समय उन्होंने 2 वर्ष समाप्ति के पश्चात खुद आंकड़े प्रस्तुत किए थे, जो मैं फटाफट जल्दी से आप सबके सामने रखना चाहूंगा। आरबीआई ने टोटल 12 केसेस इंडियन गवर्नमेंट के साथ में कंसर्न किए थे कि ये हमारी प्राथमिकता रहेगी कि हम उनको जल्दी से जल्दी समाप्त करें, जिसमें भूषण स्टील का केस था, एसआर लिमिटेड का केस था और भी बहुत सारे, टोटल 12 कंपनीज का केस था, जिसके अंदर अराउंड 3 लाख करोड़ रुपीज का 3 लाख करोड़ रुपीज फंसे हुए थे। उसमें से जब भूषण स्टील का केस समाप्त हुआ तो हमें वहां से 32,000 करोड़ रुपए अलग अलग, क्योंकि वो जो रहता है वाटरफॉल मैनेजमेंट, जिसके तहत आप सबसे पहले एम्प्लॉयज को देते हो, फिर उसके बाद आप सिक्योर्ड क्रेडिटर्स को देते हो एंड देन गवर्नमेंट टेक द रिमेनिंग पार्ट ऑफ दैट। सो उस तरीके से भूषण स्टील का जो रिजल्ट आया उसको मैं अपने नेक्स्ट स्पीच में थोड़ा सा कोशिश करूंगा बताने की, उसके माध्यम समझ सकते हैं कि अच्छे उसको मैं डेबिट करना चाहिए।
Thank you, sir. Jairam Ramesh.
Thank you, Sir Chairman and Deputy Chairman. I would like to talk first about the difference of where insolvency and bankruptcy in the gray line which differs these two major terms. Now, a person is declared insolvent or declares himself as insolvent when he is not able to repay the loans or the dues set upon him. Now, when there is a judicial intervention or when he is moved to the court to talk about his insolvency, it's the court who declares him as a bankrupt person, because now there is a legal intervention which has taken place. Now the government says that they planned to bring this IBC 2016, keeping in mind that they wanted to fasten the resolution process, and also there would be less judicial intervention. So now here, I don't know why I find this really illogically inaccurate, that at a place where judicial intervention is the most important thing, why are we actually removing, or why are we actually not giving judiciary the power which it basically has in itself? Now I would like to talk about the timeline of how this entire process of initiating the resolution process basically works. Now at the admission stage, it has the NCLT, that's National Company Law Tribunal, has 14 days for either admission or rejection of the application filed by the committee of creditors against a corporate debtor. Now, if it has to be rejected, it has to be given 7 days in particular to the debtor to rectify his defects. So now looking at the process, it's actually a very elongated process. Now this lacks clarity because we do not know, is it mandatory in nature or is it very directory? Now, let us go back to the case of JK Jute Mills Company versus Messrs Surendra Trading Company. In this, the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal held that time is in essence and procedure should be followed except in exceptional circumstances. Now, what are these exceptional circumstances is again my doubt, because this is something which is not being covered. Now, there is this very famous principle in law, Sir Chairman, that if there is a statutory functionary which has been asked to perform its duty within a time-bound manner, the same would be directory in nature and not mandatory. So are we assuming that this entire process is also directory in nature and it is not mandatory to be followed in that way? Now, if the process is not completed in 180 days, it can be extended till 270 days. Now, this I genuinely understand keeps on happening on the case-to-case basis. So there are some, ambiguity in there is some ambiguity which needs to be clear in this house today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Shri Sanjay Singh.
Yes. Okay. So thank you for letting me speak again. The recent amendments in the IBC have come in order to safeguard the interests of the corporate debtors during these unprecedented times as stated by the government. The amendment brought under this code will kind of affect the companies which are already under the CIRP. The commercial feasibility and viability of an approved resolution plan may get changed, and the resolution applicant may find it difficult to implement the terms and schedules which are envisaged in the resolution plan itself. Due to COVID-19, we all know we have faced many consequences due to which business aren't operating well. As we have seen, the economy is not in a good shape, and the resolution plan is bound to fail, which has been already passed, and thus it can lead to the liquidation of the company perhaps. The IBC has no provision addressing of a resolution applicant regarding the implementation of resolution plan, and the government seems to be a bit oblivious towards this respect. There is no mechanism provided for the company if it is pushed to liquidation during a national health emergency. So considering during the time when we are facing a pandemic, can an approved resolution plan be modified taking the present crisis, and whether the adjudicating authority has the power to modify the plan? If yes, then it is great. But if no, the adjudicating authority must be given some kind of a power to modify this resolution plan. And the other problem that I want to address in this committee is that the suspension of the voluntary insolvency, as it has been made clear by the recent amendments which has been come in times of this unprecedented situation, the exit closure of corporates should have been made easier. Instead, the ordinance prevents filing and admission of voluntary insolvency application, and this is self-defeating to the corporate debtors. The only other, if there is a corporate debtor who is not really able to handle his business, and he's not really able to handle the debts that he is having, he might want to just get himself insolvent. And also for the aggrieved debtors are winding up their business according to Chapter 20 of Companies Act, which is, after since the IBC code has come, it has given an overriding effect and it has never been used. So I think so this is some kind of a problem which has been really related to the voluntary liquidation under the recent amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Shri Ghulam Nabi Azad.
Thank you, Chair and the Deputy Chair. Firstly, I would like to say that as effective as this code seems to be, it does have certain loopholes when it comes to certain provisions relating to related parties. As we know that the code does speak about related parties throughout, but it does leave a space for Section 14 of the code. So the scope of Section 14 under Section 14 subsection 2 of the code explicitly implies that the supply of essential goods or services of the corporate debtor, as may be specified, shall not be terminated or suspended or interrupted during the moratorium period. Further explaining the nature of such essentials, non-goods and goods and services essential for the running of the administration of the corporate debtor in the light of CIRP. Such expenses of corporate debtor are in the nature of insolvency resolution process costs. My contention is not in contrary to the purpose of this section. Rather, in my observation, it may and it can result into slippage of funds and may drain companies' balance sheet of its cash in the form of payments for essential goods and services provided by related parties to the corporate debtor, against whom the creditors have moved. Yes, if such essential commodity suppliers or are deemed to be related parties to the corporate debtor, then it shall erode the very purpose of the code of delivering and maximizing the value of the assets for the corporate debtor, while the related parties to such transactions may take undue advantage to shift funds from their undischarged company facing CIRP proceedings into such related party entities' accounts. Furthermore, as per Section 53 of the Code, it is visible that the essential such expenses such essential expenses shall have priority as the insolvency resolution process costs and shall rank before the creditors of the corporate debtor. So I would beg to seek attention of the House to address this effect.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Kapil Sibal.
Thank you, Chair, for the recognition. The IBC Code of 2016 is a good effort by the government, but there are some loopholes and some ambiguities which need to be solved. I think 29A is too inclusive, and we will be talking about it in coming speeches. Then I would also like to bring to the notice of this committee uh, the operational and secured creditors difference that is there. And then I would also like to say that there is doubt whether the ordinance of which came in March was introspective or retrospective. And in the case, if it is retrospectively, then the tribunal will dismiss all the cases irrespective of earlier stand on admission, admitted or not, but not adjudicated. The decision may be correct by holding only the banker as lender to SME and MSME in mind, but out of 100 cases filed by creditors, about 60% are by creditors and not by the banker. The very important point is more than 50% cases reach settlement without order for proceedings. In such a case, is it not the stand taken by the court requires correction or needs a clarification from the government? And there are various ambiguities related to the law, which I would further clarify later. And then I would like to say that this is a attempt made by BJP again to make sure that crony capitalists never go bankrupt, as I believe that it is this law is highly biased towards the debtor, and creditors are not getting what they want, and the banks are about 65 to 70% haircut, as reported in some newspapers over the last 4 years.
Thank you, sir. Gehlot sir. You're on mute.
So can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Perfect. I'm very fascinated sometimes by how Sibal Saab makes everything a courtroom, where he begins with this is a nice legislation, but there's a lot of bias to it. Anyway, we now come to the points. I'm going to first address the points that have been made by my fellow parliamentarians. The first by Jairam, with the question being when Bhajpa, when the NDA Plus brought out this act, they said that there should not be much of an interference of the judiciary. Why is it so? The reason as to why we do not want a constant meddling of the judiciary into this issue and only have one straight of cases is because the judiciary as it stands today has a lot of backlog of cases anyway. And these cases, which are of the essence of time, are going to be lost in transition if we give the normal hierarchy of the judiciary, which is the lower court, district court, metropolitan, lower district, high court, Supreme Court. If we give the same hierarchy of judiciary the ambit to decide on these cases, it's going to add on, number one, to the backlog of cases, and number two, justice is going to be delayed and hence denied. Now, when it comes to the J.K. Jute Mills case, the definition of exceptional circumstances, ma'am, was not given by the ministry. It was given by the tribunal. So I believe the question as to what comes under the ambit of exceptional circumstances should be a question that should be directed to the Company Law Tribunal and not to the government. Now we come to the queries that were raised by Mr. Sanjay Singh, wherein it was spoken about how companies would be forced to liquidation. May I bring to his kind attention that from March, for the coming 6 months, no resolution process can be initiated. If no resolution process can be initiated, then no liquidation can happen, because it is only after the general resolution process fails can a company be pushed for liquidation. That's one. Secondly, we have categorically made it clear that with IBC, we want to have a creditor-primary, creditor-centric approach to the issue. So the creditors' best interests are going to be primary. In cases of genuine corporate debtors, I am very, very certain that the NCLT and the NCLAT are very, very well equipped to decide on the issue on a case-to-case basis. Now I come to Azad Saab's understanding of Section 53 status, which is given to creditors. We need to now consider this. If we delve into the nature of debts, repayment of financial debts infuse capital into the economy. In as much as banks and financial institutions may further lend such money to other enterprises, startups, local merchants, and businesses. Hence, in a question of the higher position and credence that financial creditors occupy over operational creditors, Section 53 stands true to the constitutional validity. I would answer the other questions in the further speeches. Apologies. Thank you.
Thank you,
Point
sir.
of personal privilege.
Yes, ma'am.
Sir, if the fellow parliamentarian has no problem, could he please repeat his verbatim where he spoke about some general resolution failing and then can IBC invoke? He said something related to this. Can you repeat his verbatim for this?
Yeah, देखो, you are, I'll give a briefing again on some things that you might have skipped. पहली चीज ये कि there is nothing as point of personal privilege, ठीक है ना? The only point that you have as a parliamentarian is a point of order. Even if you want to seek a procedural inquiry, you can just let me know, raise your hand and I'll entertain it.
Okay.
तो दूसरा ये है कि if you want कि he gives you a gist of what he said later, तो क्योंकि मैंने तो नहीं नोट करके रखा है anywhere, I'm just doing something else that is of primary concern to you. तो I would humbly request कि Mr. T.C. Gehlot, sir, whatever is her request, you can just clarify it either through a personal message या फिर however appropriate you feel about it. कि अभी तुम्हें clarify देना है तो you can do it, but do it as quickly as possible.
I did not understand the question, sir.
हाँ, even I did. तो वही है कि क्या नाम है आपका? Mr. Jayram Ramesh. Sir, can you please repeat your question again?
Sir, for the benefit of the committee, can I type it on the group?
हाँ, बिल्कुल. That's the best that you can do.
Okay.
है ना?
Thank you, sir.
So we would expect कि Mr. T.C. Gehlot can read out that question and answer it whenever he feels appropriate. है ना?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Or include it in the next speech.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
ठीक है? Thank you.
Sir, hello.
Yes.
Yes, tell me.
So my fellow parliamentarian, sir, T.C. Gehlot, had misinterpreted what my contentions were. My contentions were not with
See. 1 minute. इसमें होता क्या है, बहुत सिंपल है. जब आपकी अपॉर्चुनिटी आएगी बोलने की, तो आपको जो लगता है कि इसने क्या गलत समझा, क्या ऐसा समझा, आप अपनी स्पीच में इंक्लूड करो. ठीक है? अभी मेरे हिसाब से द फ्लोर इज सपोज्ड टू बी गिवन टू मैडम श्रीमती समपति, है ना?
Yes.
तो उनका टाइम है बोलने का. तो प्लीज मैम कंटिन्यू.
Yeah, greetings to the parliamentarians and the speaker. So, as Gehlot ji and Jaishankar ji have said, like they've mentioned it, that why is the code necessary at this moment. I would just like to conclude it in that way that it is a provision which is a singular umbrella. It kind of all the other provisions which deal with the insolvency and the bankruptcy provisions in India have been have been brought in consistency with this code. So this code repeals the SICA Act and the Presidency Terms Insolvency Act, and it also establishes NCLT and NCLAT as the adjudicating authorities. So the problems with SICA and the DRT were that they weren't very efficient, and there was no recovery as such. As SICA as in the SICA, the SIG industry would go under the BIFR procedures, and the banks had absolutely no claim to initiate no claims and could not initiate any further proceeding, because there was like, if they entered into BFIR, it was too late. So then there was no provision for the SIG industry to initiate that. So under the IBC, Jaishankar ji and Gehlot ji have said that it is a growing legislation, and I agree with it. Time and again, IBC has brought in amendments which are very consistent and which have dealt with the problems whenever they have arisen. Also, I would like to mention the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index, which has been improved by 14 places to 63rd position in 2019, and which was 108 in the 2018. Also, I would like to state of the amendments that have been brought under the code. So the amendments of few amendments that have been brought is giving home buyers the status of a financial creditor, bringing the MSMEs are not categorized as willful debtors, so they can bid on their assets, lower voting threshold from 75% to 66%. Also, Section 29A is one of the landmark amendments that they have brought, which prohibits the willful defaulters to bid on their assets again. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Mir Fayad, sir.
So I came across this really interesting IBBI's newsletter for the latest quarter. In that, I came across some really interesting statistics. So in order to ascertain the effectiveness of the IBC, we can not rely on arguments. Let's look at the numbers first, right? So according to the newsletter, there were 3,312 total cases under IBC which were registered, out of which 970 cases were closed. Out of these closed cases, 780 cases went for liquidation, right? Now, out of the 780 cases which went for liquidation, only 51 cases did actually liquidate. Only 51 companies did actually liquidate out of 780. From this 51 companies, the total claims made was 9,870 crores, and what creditors realized was 96 crores. Out of 9,870 crores, creditors realized only 96 crores. This puts the recovery rate at 1%. Another, so this is one part. This is the companies which went under total liquidation. Now we come towards the companies in the 780 bracket, right? In that scenario, 3,51,000 crores was ordered by the courts as default, out of which they were able to realize 1,50,000 crores. So this 1,50,000 crores out of 3,51,000 crores makes the recovery at 43% and a haircut of 57%. That is what the current scenario is under IBC. Now, while I realize that this is a scenario where it's 57% haircut compared to nothing being given to the creditors, it still does not realize what the code actually set out to achieve, right? Another very interesting and good observation which I found in this is, if you take out Electro Steel, Bhushan Steel, Monnet Export, SR Steel, Alok Industries, Bhushan Power and Steel, and Jyoti Structures, right? The total realization, the figure which I gave you of 43% recovery and 57% haircut, that figure comes down to 10% realization and 90% haircut, because these 7 companies, they constituted a very large chunk of the liquidated companies. These were what you would call as big ticket items. So if you take these out, this essentially means that the smaller firms, right, their liquidation process is way much slower than what we see in the cases of bigger firms. While I applaud the act and a 43% recovery, I think this could be much better. So we can deliberate upon this more. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Jairam Ramesh.
Sir, before we move forward, with the permission of the chairman, can Mr. Mir Fayaz furnish the document, this recent newsletter of the IBBI on the...
Just let me, what I'll do is कि जो भी document के reference में he centralized his speech. So
Yes, sir.
again, जो भी है you can just submit it to the secretariat if you want to. ठीक है?
Right.
Give it to our scribe, and scribe will put it to everyone's view in the group. ठीक है? चलो.
Jairam Ramesh.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Sir Chairman. Before we move ahead, I would just like to say to the members of the members of the government that if there are more cases with the judiciary, it cannot be a reason to take away their power or take away the power they hold or restrict their intervention of the same. All you can do is find other solutions through which you can actually reduce the pendency of cases and the burden on judiciary. Now, moving ahead, I would like to consult to the matter of Binani Industries Limited versus the Bank of Baroda and another, where the NCLAT clarified the objectives of the code, saying that the first order objective is the resolution, and the second order objective is the maximization of value assets of the debtor. Now, if you look at the code, if you look at the code and through its intricacies, Sir Chairman, you will realize that this code somewhere or the other place favors the creditors, but does not give solutions to the problems faced by the debtors per se. This is what I've been highlighting earlier also, that if there are problems which debtors have been facing, the code has to have solutions to the problems they have been facing. But if you look at the code, it clearly favors the creditors. I agree to the fact that the creditors are the person probably who have been losing money, or the money of the general public is going, but that does not mean that you also take away the rights of the debtors. Now, there are a few sections on which the constitutional validity is being concerned, and still there are matters subjudiced, where it's said that there are sections which are against the principles of natural justice, where the debtor is not given a right to be heard. Now, the concept of audi alteram partem clearly stands here. Because if the debtor is not given his right of hearing, then he is not able to put his case at the very first place. Now, moving slightly away from what I've been talking for the last 2 minutes, I would like to say that the new law does not even have provisions for cooperation between Indian and foreign courts to deal with overseas insolvency issues. Now, I know the government will come up with a defense argument saying that India does not have foreign jurisdiction in our courts, but that is not the matter. There are matters where the UNCITRAL or the UNCLOS, or there are other tribunals where matters of arbitration and other cases related to insolvency are considered, and our courts take consideration from the foreign courts. And it is also seen that there has been excessive government intervention with regard to the appointment, termination, and inspection of the insolvency resolution professionals. Now, they feel that the new law is, I definitely feel with members of the opposition that the new law is tilted towards the creditors, as I had already mentioned in the previous speech. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sir, I need one clarification.
Yes.
Sir, so the portfolio of Jairam Ramesh mentioned some case versus Baroda Bank.
Yes,
Okay.
sir. It is the so Chairman. Can I?
Sir, again, please, as even Ishan sir said, please clarify it among yourself in the chat, personal chat, or somewhere else, if that is feasible.
I second what Rishikesh said. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Jai Shankar sir.
थैंक यू सर। सबसे पहले तो मुझे अब तक खेद है कि विपक्ष के सदस्यों को अब तक संज्ञान में नहीं आया है कि समस्या क्या है और समस्या की मूल जड़ क्या है। एनपीए की समस्या अपने इस देश में और भारत की अर्थव्यवस्था में इतनी बड़ी क्यों हुई, अगर मैं इसको थोड़ा सा गहराई में जाकर समझाने का प्रयास करूं तो 2003 से 2008 के बीच में बहुत सारे लोन दिए गए। उस समय ऐसा कहा जाता था कि भारत की अर्थव्यवस्था इकोनॉमिक बूम है, इसलिए वहां पे एक अच्छे इंटेंशन के साथ में दिए गए थे कि हमारी अर्थव्यवस्था ग्रो करेगी। लेकिन प्रश्न चिन्ह तब पैदा होता है जब वो सारे लोन्स बिना सिक्योरिटी के दिए गए थे। किसी भी प्रकार की सिक्योरिटी जब आप अपने डेटर से नहीं लेते तब आपका इंटेंशन पे प्रश्न चिन्ह खड़ा होता है। फिर दूसरी एक बात रहती है कि एनपी की जो डेफिनेशन थी वो 2004 से 2014 तक कई बार बदली। मतलब बैंकों के एसेट्स एनपीएस की कैटेगरी में आ रहे थे, लेकिन यू ऑलवेज चेंज द डेफिनेशन ऑफ एनपीए और जस्ट यू हैव evergreening the loans given to different debtors। इसको अगर मैं एक डिफरेंट टर्म में कहूँ तो विंडो ड्रेसिंग की गई कंटिन्यूसली और देश की आंखों में धूल झोंकी गई। अब जब 2015 में आरबीआई की एसेट रिव्यू कमेटी ने सारे एसेट बैंकों के एसेट्स का रिव्यू किया, तब जाके जो एनपीए 2.5% था पहले, वो आके 4% पे चला गया। तो इस तरीके से हमें चीज को समझना चाहिए कि ये समस्या 2015 में हम सबके सामने उजागर हुई और जो एक्यूमुलेटिव जितने भी एनपीएस थे उनको अब धीरे धीरे सुलझाया जा रहा है। दूसरी बात, मोहम्मद फैज साहब ने एक पॉइंट आउट किया था कि बहुत कम अमाउंट का लिक्विडेशन रिलीज हो रहा है। तो एक बात मैं स्पष्ट कर दूं कि अपने अर्थव्यवस्था में दो तरह के एंटरप्रेन्योर होते हैं। एक होता है कि आपका सपोज आपका एक स्टील प्लांट है तो डेफिनेटली आपके पास में एक प्लांट होगा, आपके पास में एक अच्छा सी जमीन होगी और आपके पास में बहुत सारे लिक्विड और परमानेंट एसेट्स होंगे। तो उसके थ्रू जब आपका लिक्विडेशन होगा तो अच्छा सा अमाउंट आ सकता है। और दूसरा अगर एक एंटरप्रेन्योर होता है जिसके अंदर एक जस्ट एक ट्रेडिंग कंपनी है जो इलीगल तरीके से सिर्फ कागजों पर चल रही है, उसको किसी बैंक ने लोन दिया है और अब उसका लिक्विडेशन प्रोसेस चल रहा है, तो हम इतनी उम्मीद नहीं कर सकते कि उससे जो है सपोज 1000 करोड़ में से आप उनमें से 500 या 600 करोड़ वापस ले आएंगे, क्योंकि वहां उनके पास इन रियल एसेट्स नहीं है। इसलिए जब लिक्विडेशन वैल्यू किसी भी एसेट की काउंट करनी होती है तो वो एट द कमेंसमेंट ऑफ द रिजोल्यूशन प्रोसेस जो रहता है उस समय काउंट की जाती है, क्योंकि पहले ये नियम हुआ करता था कि जब आपका प्रोसेस खत्म हो जाए उस समय जो आपके एसेट्स की वैल्यू है वो काउंट करेंगे। लेकिन अभी इसको चेंज करते कमेंसमेंट में किया गया ताकि जितने भी हमारे पास में संपत्ति है उस कंपनी के पास में उसका पूर्ण जो पैसा है उसको सुनिश्चित किया जा सके। एक रमेश साहब और कह दूं कि एनसीएलटी के पास में वर्तमान में सुप्रीम कोर्ट से ज्यादा जजेस हैं, इसलिए सुप्रीम कोर्ट की तुलना में अगर जितने भी केसेस यहाँ जल्दी खत्म हो जाए बेटर रहेगा। धन्यवाद।
थैंक यू सर। सर संजय सिंह।
Sir, now I want to raise another issue which is related to section 32A of the code. So now the section 32A of the code, the problem mainly here is seen in the case of Bhushan Power and Steel Limited, where the Directorate of Enforcement of Central Government, that is the ED, attached the assets of BPSL under section 5 of the Prevention of Money Laundering Act 2002, which was contrary to the section 32A. And that thus this was reversed by the jurisdiction of our adjudicating authority. But sir, you know, this kind of things can again happen in the near future. And I want to ask a simple question to the government, that how will the amendment address the law laid by the Delhi High Court in the case of the Deputy Director of ED versus Axis Bank, where it was held that the objective of PMLA is for distinct purpose and IBC cannot prevail on the former. And lastly, sir, if we are seeing that these statutory authorities like ED and the SEBI that may have claims against insolvent entities, can they be considered as the operational creditors of this book? Because this would also allow such statutory authorities to claim the proceeds due to them in the resolution process and clearly bring them within the fold of the code. At the same time, balance the policy objectives of different legislation. with that of the code. And the second thing that I want to make sure that what the respected leader of the house said related to the amendment, what I wanted to convey is that the amendment that is 10A can also lead to the excess of cases after when we come out of this pandemic. For example, if there is a company which really wants to which is really in a heavy debt and it wants to declare themselves as insolvent, but because of this amendment they cannot, because there is some restriction which has been applied upon them, seeing the prevailing circumstances. So there can be two instances. At first, that I said that it could lead to the excess burden on the judiciary itself to look into these cases. And second, the assets of those company the value of those assets might start decline. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Gehlot sir.
Thank you, sir. I'll go to first Kapil Sibal साहब का जो पहला point था, which is about the retrospective effect. So, in our opinion, as is also mandated by the Supreme Court, the Act does not have a retrospective effect, and this is okay. I'll come to that in a while. So, Jairam Ramesh Madam ne kaha tha ki taking away the power of the judiciary is something that we cannot do, and we are not doing it, because when you look at section 60 read with section 238 of the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code, it specifically says that the Code of Civil Procedure shall not have any relevance when it comes to IBC. Hence, civil courts will not be having the authority to adjudicate on this matter. NCLT say agar there is any appeal, it will go to NCLAT. NCLAT say if there is any appeal, it will go to the Supreme Court or the High Court, as the case would be. Why are we not taking into consideration the metropolitan magistrate courts? Is because, in our opinion, they're not as well equipped as the NCLT would be, because the NCLT is a very good mixture of judges and of technical members. Hence, that is what we meant. Secondly, ma'am came and made a blanket statement as to debtors are not given a right to be heard in certain provisions of the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code without telling us which section of the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code it is. And third and the last thing is, what about those cases where one or more of the parties belong to a foreign nation? You need to understand, for that we have the PMLA. You also need to understand that the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code deals with civil issues, not criminal issues. And if there is any cross-national issue, then it will definitely have a criminal component, because then the person has left the country criminally, erroneously, and hence the Enforcement Directorate and the provisions of PMLA will come to place, not IBC. Now we come to the issues that we wanted to bring to the kind attention of the Sabha. Please take into consideration this one fact that, so as I last said, IBC is not arbitrary, and everyone has to take into consideration the primary focus of the IBC is to ensure the revival and continuation of the corporate debtor by protecting the corporate debtor from its own management, that is from other resolution applicants, and from a corporate debt by liquidation. Therefore, IBC is a beneficial legislation which puts the corporate debtor back on its feet and acts as a recovery legislation for the creditors. The Supreme Court had decided, to finish this up, again in the Swiss Ribbons case, the presence of an intelligible differentia based on the anvil of Article 14, which I will continue in the coming speeches. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, Ghulam Nabi Azad.
Thank you, sir, Deputy Chairman. I would like to bring to your notice that Sir T.C. Gehlot, in his earlier statements, said that I was talking about Section 53 of the code, which he wrongly interpreted, because I was talking about Section 14, subsection 2 of the code, which did not mention or was silent about the related parties, suppliers, which could supply essential goods to the corporate debtor. So I have no contrary feelings towards Section 53, and I think that Section 53 is in order. It's just that the Section 14, subsection 2 is pretty silent on the issue of related party transactions when it comes to essential non-input goods. Apart from that, I hope I'm clear to Mr. Gehlot. Apart from that, as far as the applicability of Section 10 of the code goes, the corporate debtor can independently initiate the corporate insolvency resolution process on itself, owing to certain circumstances as discussed in the section. As far as the requirement of the initiation of such process goes on, the corporate debtor shall submit to the adjudicating authority its books of accounts and such documents pertinent to support its claim. It is but pertinent fact that many, if not all corporates in the horizon of at least 6 years below the government's nose have falsified and doctored the books of accounts and the financial statements, starting with the likes of ILNFS, Bhushan Steel and DHFL. What's more shocking was the involvement of big names in the audit industry, helping and certifying the misrepresentations of the likes of such companies mentioned above. Way forward, funds are siphoned off the balance sheet of such corporates, slipped into the pockets of individuals closely related to the companies. And as the essence of the code goes, the effectiveness of the IBC is in the value provided to the stakeholders involved, which are the creditors and the shareholders through the corporates. It does seem to, So it is observed that the section under consideration does not serve the purpose of the code. In the light of such massive stewardship and agency blunder, or I may call it a scandal, the stakeholders, including external creditors, along with the shareholders, are exposed to a massive degree of adulteration of financial statements and the annexures to it. So this forms an urgent need to formulate policies of this and rectify the utility of this section.
Thank you, sir. Sir Jairam Ramesh.
Thank you, Sir Chairman. Before starting and highlighting what points I wanted to bring up, I would say to members of the government that we understand the problem, we understand the concern, and but we also strive to find more solutions and resolutions instead of just supporting or favoring the creditors. I understand that, sir, even we work for the people, we aim to work for the people like you people do. But sir, that way we cannot take away the rights of a debtor, right? Now, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. So, I would like to actually just quote what Section 238 is, because it was spoken in this committee right now, that it is the Section 238 of the code provides that the provisions of this code shall have effect, notwithstanding anything inconsistent therewith contained in any other law for the time being in force, or any instrument having effect by virtue of any such law. I was just stating this section because the section came out in the committee, and it was important to know the verbatim of the section. Now, sir, Chairman, since morning we have been hearing about stakeholders and how we have to protect the money of the stakeholders. Sir, why aren't the stakeholders then not given the right or opportunity to file an application for liquidation? I agree that they have the right and opportunity to file an application for the CIRP, but not for liquidation. Now, coming to Section 8 of what IBC basically is, it deals with around something called as a term dispute. Now, even if we agree that IBC has been taken as a positive step, or it's moving in a positive it is still not very free from its ambiguity. Now, Section 8 of the Act provides the term called dispute. Now, this term is not clearly defined in the Act, because of which we need to rely on precedents by various tribunals or benches. Now, there can be difference of opinion or different interpretation because it's not clearly defined. Now, let's take the example that the Mumbai bench gave a strict interpretation of the term, that the term included, which means that the term means in the section should be interpreted as included. I apologize if vice is the words. I just missed on the words. It's like if the term includes, has to be interpreted as means. But the principal bench gave a very liberal interpretation to the very same thing. Now here, what point of contention arises is which interpretation is basically the correct one and should supersede. I agree that the appellate interpretation will supersede, but then what about the interpretations derived by various other codes? So this act needs to be free from its ambiguity real soon. Thank you.
Thank you, man. Gailat's up.
Thank you, sir. What Madam Jairam Ramesh missed out on mentioning is that I had said Section 238 read with Section 60, which clearly says that the CPC shall not have superintendence when it comes to the way the NCLT works. Anyway, when it comes to the concern of Sir Gulab Nabi Azad, he needs to understand that the definition of a related party, be it for Section 14 Clause 2, for the purposes of 14 Clause 2, or for any other part of the code, is clearly mentioned as someone who should not have any prior business dealings with the corporate debtor. If this is the definition, at least of what, this is the understanding of what a related party is. So if I were to be a corporate debtor and Gulab Nabi Azad happens to be a brother of mine, which he is, and in such a scenario, if I have been disqualified to be a resolution applicant, he will necessarily not be disqualified until and unless he has some prior business dealing with me. So Section 14 Clause 2 is pretty unequivocal for that. Anyway, we now, it's pretty clear on those terms. Anyway, we now move on to where I last left off at the anvil of Article 40. Placing reliance on the Bankruptcy Law Reforms Committee 2015, the Supreme Court had identified that financial creditors were generally secured, consisted of banking companies and financial institutions. Operational creditors, generally unsecured, consisted of entities which supply goods and services. There is a stark difference between the nature of loan agreements with financial creditors who provide for working capital loans, term loans, etc., and contracts with operational creditors for supply of goods and services. The difference between a financial creditor and an operational creditor, one of the reasons as to why both of them are not kept in the same pedestal, is that financial creditors have to prove default on the corporate debtor's end, whereas an operational creditor has to merely claim a right to payment of a liability or an obligation in respect of a debt which may be due. So the burden of proof between the two of them is very, very different. The exemption provided to financial creditors to establish the absence of dispute, which is otherwise placed on operational creditors, is the particular reason as to why, as per Section 21, read with Section 24, operational creditors are barred from representing and voting in the Committee of Creditors, to bring to everyone's attention why they are not the same. Regarding NCLTs and NCLATs, the constitutionality of NCLT and NCLAT is consistent with the Madras Bar Association Case 1 and the Madras Bar Association Case 3 decisions of the Supreme Court. It is pertinent to note that the appointment to the NCLT and NCLAT have been made by a selection committee constituted in accordance with the aforementioned Supreme Court decisions. Again, to remind to everyone as to why am I mentioning this, is to speak on the constitutionality of the provisions of the IBC. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mir Fayad, sir.
Thank you, sir. So, first of all, I'd like to clarify some misconception on part of Mr. Subramanian Jaishankar. He somehow assumed that while I was talking about the recovery rates and the haircut rates, it only pertained to liquidation, right? My colleague beautifully pointed out the difference between insolvency and bankruptcy. Further in that, bankruptcy has two processes, right? One is liquidation, other is restructuring. That is why there is a different figures of 3,51,000 crores and 9,870 crores, right? 3,51,000 crores also includes the restructured companies. Anyways, so the point being, what you're trying to say, I got what you're trying to say, that अगर assets नहीं है तो realize कैसे करोगे बात, right? So in that scenario, what courts and IRPs do is they look at the goodwill and the manpower which such a company has, and if it does have that, they restructure the loans, right, with differential payment options. So that is one. Moving on to so I from what I can infer, Mr. Gehlot's my fellow parliamentarians' majority of arguments rest on the fact that he believes IBC to be a beneficial legislation tilted in favor of creditors, right? I believe that is not true, and I rely on the long title of the act, right, which quotes verbatim. An act to consolidate and amend the laws relating to reorganization and insolvency resolution of corporate persons, partnership firms, and individuals in a time-bound manner for maximization of value of assets, to promote entrepreneurship, availability of credit, and balance the interest of all the stakeholders, right? This, and further on, alteration of order of priority of payments. Now, this long title, which gives us an essence as to what the act aims to achieve, nowhere can I assume from any word or from any statement that it is tilted towards the creditors, right? If it's not tilted towards the creditors, it expressly mentions balance of the interest of all the stakeholders. We can reasonably assume it to be a legislation that is in interest of everyone, right? So if it is in interest of everyone, we should be focusing on making it more streamlined so that we can realize more and more money. We can have quicker resolution mechanisms. We can have a much more equitable payment options, right? For example, we see that financial creditors usually take financial and secured creditors. They usually take the front seat as compared to operational creditors. So we should aim to resolve that. We should aim for speedy recoveries. We should aim to reduce haircuts, right? So with this, I believe both of my rebuttals are done. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And Sir Jaishankar. Sorry, my bad. We'll have Sanjay Singh first.
Yes, sir. So the concern that I have, another concern is that it is related to the operational creditor. So keeping in mind all the judgments which have been made by our honorable court and the adjudicating authorities, we must, and keeping in mind the suggestion which has been given by I might say the recommendation given by the Insolvency Law Committee is to provide some kind of voting right to operational creditor in the Committee of Credit, because there can be many instances, like take for example that there is a who has only taken goods and services from many suppliers, and the amount which is to be paid to these operational creditors in advance might be more than the amount of loan taken from a financial creditor. So then, by seeing the weightage of the amount not given by the corporate debtor to the operational creditor, they must be provided with a voting right as well. And sir, even in the code, it says that if there is an entity which provides both financial and operational lending, then the weightage of the voting share of that particular entity or person is only to the extent of the financial loan given to the corporate debtor. So shouldn't the creditor be given more weightage in its voting power, as it is essentially providing both financial and operational loans, or in the viewpoint of debtor, it is the financial debt and the operational debt. Number two, keeping in mind, this is one of my concerns regarding the operational creditor. I will continue. I will also like to say that I would like to have an answer upon the concern that I raised related to the section 32 in my previous speech, and then I'm expecting an answer from the respected leader of the House. Thank you.
Sir Jaishankar.
आभार सर आपका एक बार पूरा मौका देने के लिए। मैं पहले के मेरे जो संभाषण में मैं भूषण स्टील, जिसको टाटा स्टील ने एक्वायर कर लिया था, और एक एसआर स्टील का जो केस है, एसआर स्टील एंड पावर का केस, उन दोनों पर मैं हल्का सा थोड़ा सा विस्तृत चर्चा करके फिर मैं अपने आगे वाले टॉपिक को बढ़ूंगा। भूषण स्टील को जब टाटा स्टील ने ले लिया था तो भूषण स्टील का टोटल डेप्ट अराउंड 76,000 करोड़ का था, सॉरी 56,000 करोड़ का था, और जब लिक्विडेशन उसका हुआ उस कंपनी का, तो लिक्विडेशन वैल्यू 14,000 करोड़ था। बैंक से जिन्होंने जितना भी ऋण लिया था वो प्रिंसिपल अमाउंट बैंक्स का जितना भी था वो उनको वापस मिल चुका था, और जो इक्विटी का शेयर था वो लगभग 9% के आसपास इक्विटी शेयर भी वापस मिल गया था। वाटरफॉल मैनेजमेंट के तहत जो वर्कर्स, देन सिक्योर्ड क्रेडिटर्स, और फिर एट लास्ट द गवर्नमेंट, उन तीनों को अकॉर्डिंग टू द प्रोपोर्शन जिस तरीके से पहले का बाकी था उस हिसाब से उनको दिया गया था। बिकॉज 35,000 करोड़ के आसपास 53 फाइनेंशियल क्रेडिटर्स को सारा अमाउंट कॉन्ट्रीब्यूट किया गया था, और 3,000 करोड़ के आसपास का जो था वो ऑपरेशनल क्रेडिटर्स को कंट्रीब्यूट किया गया था, उनको दिया गया था। दूसरा एसआर स्टील एंड पावर का जो केस है, उसमें ये रिया फैमिली का जो केस था, उसमें समस्या ये उत्पन्न हो रही है कि अभी वर्तमान में कोविड-19 के आने के बाद में स्टील इंडस्ट्री की एक बार पुनः बहुत ज़्यादा डिमांड में आ गई, और इस वजह से उस फैमिली को लगने लगा है कि वापस हम लोग प्रॉफिट कमा सकते हैं। इसलिए उन्होंने इस एसआर स्टील वाले केस में जिंदल, क्योंकि वो दूसरे वाले केस में तो जिंदल थे, इसमें एसआर स्टील वाले में थोड़ी सी समस्या है। दूसरा, जयराम रमेश आजाद साहब ने कहा कि एसेंशियल गुड्स एंड सप्लाईज के बारे में उनका कुछ कंसर्न था। तो बेसिकली जब 90 डेज का डिफॉल्ट हो जाता है उसके बाद में और रिजोल्यूशन प्रोसेस स्टार्ट होता है, तो उसमें एक सीधा सा कॉन्सेप्ट ये है कि जो मैनेजमेंट, कंपनी का मैनेजमेंट जो होता है वो बोर्ड ऑफ डायरेक्टर्स से निकल के जो रिजोल्यूशन प्रोफेशनल्स होते हैं उनके पास में आ जाता है, उनके हाथ में आ जाता है। और जब तक रिजोल्यूशन प्रोसेस रहता है तब तक, क्योंकि कंपनी का जो कंट्रोल है वो मैनेजमेंट से हट के, बोर्ड ऑफ डायरेक्टर से हट के वापस जब आरपीएस के पास में आ जाता है, तो उनका ये उम्मीद रहती है कि वो लिक्विडेशन में जाने से पहले ये कोशिश करें कि या तो उनके लोन को रिस्ट्रक्चर किया जाए अकॉर्डिंग टू द प्लान, और या फिर उनको एक इस तरीके से उनका वापस कंट्रोल, इस तरीके से उस बिजनेस को रन किया जाए कि जल्दी से वो वापस अपने एक काम चलने वाले कंडीशन में आ सके। इसलिए, और दूसरा, जब इस तरह की प्रॉब्लम आती है तो आईपीएस और ये जो रिजोल्यूशन प्रोफेशनल्स होते हैं उनकी काफ़ी सारी ड्यूटीज़ बनती हैं। एक तो वो बोर्ड ऑफ डायरेक्टर्स, वो अपने आप में ही एक बोर्ड ऑफ डायरेक्टर्स बन जाते हैं, और कंपनीज को बैंक अकाउंट्स होते हैं वो भी फिर आईपीएस और आरपी यही लोग इसको देखते हैं। दूसरा, एप्लीकेंट को डेटर्स के लिए क्या क्या, ये जयराम रमेश साहब का कंसर्न था। मैं जस्ट इतना सा बताऊँ कि उनको खुद को एप्लीकेंट इसलिए बनाया गया ताकि अगर उनको खुद को लगे कि हमसे कंपनी रन नहीं हो रही है तो हम उसको लिक्विडेशन के लिए या उस प्रोसेस में, कॉर्पोरेट इंसॉल्वेंसी प्रोसेस में डाल सकते हैं। धन्यवाद।
थैंक यू सर। गलत सर।
Thank you, sir. So I will tackle Mir Fayaz Saab ka concern first. That his statement where he says that in the long note of the preambulatory note of the act, it's not mentioned anywhere that creditor is primary or anything. But to bring to his kind attention the case of Innovative Industries Limited versus ICICI Bank, which was the first substantive ruling by the Supreme Court in the IBC with regards to the IBC. Here, the Supreme Court had very, very clearly held that the IBC demonstrates clearly the need for a stringent corporate insolvency framework in India, and the demonstration of a paradigm shift from the erstwhile insolvency framework, which followed a debtor in possession approach, to one that is more creditor friendly. Hence, building up on this understanding of the decision of the Supreme Court, we come to the conclusion that the interests of the creditor are taken care of first. The corporate debtor's interests are on a comparatively lower paradigm. Now, I'm going to then go over to the last point where I left off, which is with regards to operational creditors and why they are excluded from the committee of creditors. There lies a major demarcation between the qualifications of the financial creditors and the operational creditors, as I've already mentioned. Financial creditors like banks and financial institutions and other institutions are often into the money lending business. and are well equipped to assess the viability and feasibility of the business of the corporate debtor. Even at the time of sanctioning of a loan, these institutions undertake detailed market studies like techno-economic valuation, business evaluation, financial projection, and thus are in a better position to evaluate the contents of a resolution plan. In the upright, high-standing understanding of the Supreme Court, the operational creditor does not have the requisite expertise to determine the viability and feasibility of the business, and they are generally involved in the supply of goods and services. Understand, this is the understanding of the Supreme Court, not our own. The legislative guide on insolvency law, along with the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, also mandates a very similar stance. Therefore, to strike a fine balance and maintain equity, Section 24, Clause 3, Section 24, Subsection 3, Clause C, clearly mandates that the operational creditor and the representatives would be present in the meeting of the COC if the amount of their aggregate dues was 10% or higher of the total debt. I'll enumerate on this in the coming speeches. Thank you.
Jairam Ramesh.
Thank you, Sir Chairman. I would like to first say and reply to Sir S. Jaishankar that I never said that there should not be voluntary voluntary steps taken by the debtors to come and say that will be the best thing if happens, that if people on themselves come on the voluntary basis and do that. My entire point was that why aren't stakeholders, particularly stakeholders, not given the right for the application of not given the right to apply for liquidation process when they're given the right to apply for the corporate insolvency resolution process, but then why not for the liquidation process was my entire point of contention. But again, not going back to that same lines, as members of the government has spoken about financial debtors and corporate and operational debt creditors, I would like to actually talk about financial debt and operational debt first. Now, a financial debt is a debt together with the interest which has to be repaid. Now, operational debt includes a claim in respect of the payment of dues arising under any law and payable to the government or any local authority. Okay, now financial creditors have been defined under Section 5, Clause 7 of the IBC, and operational debtors have been defined under Section 5, Clause 20 of the Code. Now, my entire point again revolves around the topic which I basically brought up first. Now, here, if they say that why are a particular set of debtors given more privileges and powers, I would like to direct you to an NCLT verdict. The verdict said that financial and operational creditors must be given similar treatment, which has also been interpreted to mean that the same percentage of haircut. Okay, now, and it also said that discrimination amongst financial creditors on the basis of existing priorities or security interest is not permitted in any resolution plan. Now, NCLT has also ruled that the Committee of Creditors has no role to play in determining the manner of the distribution of proceeds of a resolution plan amongst the financial and operational creditors, since the financial creditors comprising of the Committee of Creditors are interested parties and will be a conflict of interest if they are permitted to decide in the manner of distribution. So now, to keep it very equal, there have been verdicts which the NCLT tribunals have obviously been given. Now, to saying further to this, I would just say that in the court basically has to revolve around how solutions are to be brought up to solve the problems of the debtors, keeping in mind the rights of the creditors. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Sanjay Singh. Shri Sanjay Singh.
Yes, sir. Yes. Okay. So first, I want to counter by saying to the respected leader of the parliament that, sir, don't you think that these operational creditors, who are mainly the MSMEs, which provides the essential goods and services to a corporate debtor, correct? So don't you think that these MSMEs will be reluctant in future in giving goods and services on credit to some other companies? Because there is not there's no proper priority given to these operational creditors. Even at the time of liquidation, so they might have that doubt that they might not get their their debts from these corporate debtor, and they might not also file for insolvency for insolvency against these corporate debtors in future. And the second problem I want to raise is that the problems which are faced by the RP. In the code, it is mentioned that for CIRP and IRP, first will be appointed, and third the CRP of the company starts. The IRP is appointed for the first 30 days of the process, in which he has to make a public announcement inviting the claims of the creditors, and thus verified for the constitution of COC. And thus the COC have the option of either appointing him as the IP or to replace it. In 90% of the cases, they are replaced. The time limit of submitting the information memorandum is within 2 weeks, that is 14 days of his appointment, but not later than 54th day, whichever is earlier, as it is expected that he collects the data of the company. The recalcitrant promoters of the company makes it an odorous case for the IRP and IRP, as there are some companies whose assets are spread over the number of cities and states. It becomes difficult for the professional to collect that much info in just 10 to 14 days. And also the other daunting effect is that of the valuation of those shell companies as well. The financial statements of these companies not available very easily, and thus the RP has to work hard to get information pertaining to the books of accounts of those companies from the auditors, accountants, and the erstwhile directors of the company. But they constantly try to delay the process and forced to present an information memorandum on the basis of the available information, which might be incomplete, and therefore it may not show the actual state of the company. Sir, this kind of thing has happened in the matter of Martin S.K. Gola. He presented the information memorandum at the third meeting of the COC after about 8 months of the commencement of the CIRP. That means it took him almost 90 days to do it, and the time period was just getting stretched. And not only this, in an article published by the Indian Express, it is said that as of September 2019, 535 companies had spent more than the stipulated because of these reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. No more new names. Please keep adding your names.
So there have been.
I cannot see anyone after Sanjay Singh.
Sir, I have. Oh, sorry, that went in a personal chat.
Okay.
Right, my bad. My apologies.
Fair. So after Thawarchand Gehlot, those wishing to speak, please keep adding your names below. Yes, Thawarchand Gehlot, sir.
Yes, sir. May I begin?
Yes.
Yes, sir. It is surprising that in my whatever NCLT research that I have in front of me, there is no such NCLT verdict as was encompassed by Madam J.R. Ramesh. However, it is common knowledge that when there is a decision of the NCLT vis-a-vis a decision of the Supreme Court, everyone knows that the Supreme Court decision has a higher stance. This NCLT verdict, even if I were to consider what had come in 2019, the Supreme Court decision that I am referring to, directly based on which the third amendment of the IBC came to place, was a case of Swiss Ribbons, the decision of which was given in the year of 2019, which is the last Supreme Court decision on the constitutionality and on the feasibility, on the legal veracity of the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code. So I was of the opinion, as a parliamentarian, ma'am should be aware of it, but nonetheless. Now, I would go back to where I left off with regards to operational creditors and their exclusion from the committee of creditors. And there is no conceivable or conclusive data to suggest that operational creditors are adversely affected by being excluded from the committee of creditors. And why do we say this? The NCLTs, while examining the viability and feasibility plans, always inspect, number one, whether the operational creditor is given an at-par treatment with the financial creditor. And if not, then such a resolution plan is either modified accordingly or is outright rejected in toto. Hence, I do not subscribe to the fact that operational creditors are somehow given a differential treatment. With this, we now move on to the legality of the settlement under Section 12A of the IBC. In many statements and speeches made in today's session and in earlier session by the members of the opposition, Section 12A has been assailed with the allegation that prescribed threshold, my apologies, is incessantly high, requiring an approval of 90% of the members of the Committee of Creditors to allow the withdrawal of a corporate debtor from the corporate insolvency resolution process. In reality, one needs to understand that once a petition under Section 7 or under Section 9 is admitted, then the CIRP effectively becomes a proceeding in rem. In rem matlab a proceeding which affects the world at large, through which rights of the general public are affected. Hence, there is a requirement of the consent of the Committee of Creditors to allow the corporate debtors withdrawal. The requirement of the 90% approval of the COC members ensures that the liabilities of creditors are addressed in an omnibus settlement. An omnibus settlement means I do something on behalf of a lot of people around me, as most of the financial creditors have to grant their approval to the settlement proposal. Continuance in the coming speeches. Thank you.
Jairam Ramesh.
So just 1 minute. Thank you to the House for the time. Thank you, Sir Chairman. Now, before I move ahead, I would say that, Sir, to the members of the government, that we agree, and when it comes to interpretations of various courts or various different tribunals, so the act is so vague in certain cases that difference of opinion was to come up and difference in interpretation was to come up, which I've already specified to you in many of my previous speeches, that why is this problem actually coming up. Now, I would like to go back to the talk where the constitutionality was being spoken about, because we haven't much spoken about something which is very important for us to discuss. Now, if the act is not constitutionally valid, no point of discussing it henceforth, because it does not stand in accordance with the Constitution. But I would not say that the entire act is unconstitutional. There are some provisions which are so. Now, I have already spoken about the principles of natural justice earlier in my earlier speeches, but the government has not replied to it, maybe because they think that yes, it's against the, because yes, they may agree that yes, they have made such a law that is against the principles of natural justice. Let me draw your attention, Sir Chairman, to the case of Shri Metallics Limited versus the Union of India, where basically the constitutionality of Section 7 was challenged on the ground that the provisions of such section does not provide the corporate debtor an initial opportunity to be heard. My entire point from the beginning for this discussion has been that if you do not provide both the parties equal chances to represent themselves, there is no fair trial which basically takes place. Now, keeping that in mind, it is highly important for the government to basically realize, now assuming this for this simulation that this is a bill which we have been discussing, for that for the benefit of the committee, it's important that such amendments are to be made in such laws where it is not free, where it is free from ambiguity, where things are very clear, and where again and again ordinances or amendments do not need to be passed for a benefit that, because you later in an ordinance or an amendment claim it to have a retrospective effect. Now that definitely hampers the administrative part of the tribunals onto which cases do they need to apply that. Now, keeping that in mind, it is highly important for the committee to basically discuss that how can we solve this problem of constitutional validity of certain sections of the code. The rest I'll be talking about in the further speeches. Thank you so much, Sir Chairman.
Yeah, that's up.
Thank you, sir. So when a blanket statement again is made about how Section 7 is somehow constitutionally impugned, or it does not adhere to the fair principles of natural justice, or operational creditors are not given the fair chance to be heard, Madam, very, very effective, very, very, what is that word? Very, very, not exactly in a malified way, but conclusively misinterpreted the fact that there is also Section 8 and Section 9. Section 8 and Section 9, which specifically speak of how can a corporate insolvency resolution process be initiated by an operational creditor. It's been a long time since that case happened, and subsequently 2 amendments have come after that. So may we get a little nuanced in our understanding of things. Now we also need to take into consideration, as I was last speaking of, yes, the certification by, before I move into over to the certification by the information utility, I would continue the last point of the legality of a settlement under Section 12A, that under Section 60 of the IBC, an arbitrary rejection of a settlement proposal can be appealed to the NCLT, and thus the Committee of Creditors does not have the final say on the subject. So for all the times when we have had members on the aisle of the opposition convey to us an infringed, unnecessary, invisible concern of the COC having an upper hand, it does not. NCLT always weighs in. Now I go over to the next point of the certification by information utility and the constitutionality thereof. So private information utilities set up under the IBC have been condemned on the ground that they have not been governed by proper norms and that their certification cannot be conclusive evidence of default, as was also something which was pointed out a lot in 2017. However, on a more realistic axis, it is categorically evident that information utilities are in fact governed by stringent norms, by virtue of which as soon as an information of default is received, such information of default is communicated to all the parties and sureties of the debt. The law behind it is Regulation 20, read with Regulation 21 of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, Information Utility Regulation 2017. The Supreme Court has also held in the Swiss Ribbons case again that the certification of default by the information utilities is only a prima facie evidence of default, as clearly mentioned in the IBBI regulations of 2017, and hence there exists no scope of dichotomy with regards to the constitutionality of information utilities. Thank you.
Yes, Sanjay Singh.
Yes. So the issue of the information utility that the leader has clarified is to a certain extent I kind of agree to it, but there was some incident which took place. In last year only, there was a conflict between the financial ministry, the IBPI and the RBI regarding the information utility, and the dispute was simple: should any entity other than credit bureaus have independent access to a company's financial information, to a company's financial as sourced from banks? The IBPI feels it necessary, but the RBI differs. So let me enumerate more upon this. The bankruptcy law requires to provide daily verified copies of their information. Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code obliges a financial creditor to submit financial information to information utilities. These utilities is the record keepers of such documents, storing them for providing information that can be drawn upon a court or that is made clear by the IBC. So the utilities have to also ensure that these documents are subject both parties to the dispute, the lenders and the borrowers. They become verified documents on which the court and tribunals can rely to quick judgment. The RBI has issued an amendment to its notification in August last year that apparently defeats the role of the information utilities. It has mandated that the information utilities set up under the bankruptcy regime are obliged to source all information only from the credit bureau. So the primary sourcing of the information from the banks has to be carried out by these bureaus, who will then pass them on to the utilities depending on their discretion. The dispute became big enough to land on the table of Financial Stability Development Council at its last meeting, which was also chaired by the Financial Ministry. So my concern over here is, if can the government come in collaboration with the RBI to set up these kind of norms with the information utility, just to make it credible, just to make the information utility more credible and comprehensive? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Gehlot sir again.
Yes, sir. Thank you. To bring to everyone's kind attention again, as per the newsletter of the IBBI, the numbers that were given by Sir Mir Fayaz do not exist anywhere. We have already scrutinized this a couple of times, and none of us have found this. So, GGWP. Moving on, we now come to I now come to the issue that I did not want to obviously address in today's session, but considering that Sir Kapil Sibal had spoken of the retrospective effect, I have to bring this into today's session, which is the wires or the powers of Section 29A. Section 29A categorically speaks of persons ineligible to be resolution applicants. There are primarily 5 issues that have been raised by our fellow parliamentarians in the opposition benches since 2017. The first issue, as was pointed out by Sir Kapil Sibal, is about the retrospective effect, is whether Section 29A has retrospectively impaired the right of erstwhile promoters to participate in recovery process for the corporate debtor. Placing reliance upon earlier judgments of the Supreme Court, it is clear that a statute is not retrospective merely because it affects existing rights. Since the resolution applicant has no vested right for consideration or approval of the resolution plan, therefore, it was held by the Supreme Court, which we truly believe is the case as well, that Section 29A does not retrospectively impair the rights of any erstwhile promoter. That's one. Secondly, why should an erstwhile manager not guilty of malfeasance or not guilty of acting contrary to the interest of the corporate debtor be barred from taking part in the resolution process? It has also been contended in, I believe the last time we had our standing committee discussion on this, that there is no reason why during liquidation, any person, including persons not eligible to be resolution applicants, should not be allowed to purchase properties sold by the liquidator by way of public auction. To answer to this, a mere reading of Section 29A, respected sirs, of the IBC makes it abundantly clear that there are several grounds beyond malfeasance which act as a ground for disqualification for the submission of a resolution plan. Hence, there stands no question of treating unequals as equals, and this is in fact mandated by the axis of equality as per the anvil of Article 14. Now, the third issue that I would quickly want to get into is the disqualification of a person in management or control of a corporate debtor, which has remained as an NPA for a year as per RBI guidelines, Section 24C of the IBC as well, is unjustified, and the period of this 1 year is arbitrary. The answer to this question I'll continue in the next speech.
Jairam Ramesh.
Thank you, Sir Chairman. Sir, first I would like to say that I never mentioned in any of my speeches that operational creditors are not given chances to speak or to be heard, or they have been, or they lack a lot of action on them or by their end. I all wanted to say is, why not bring a law and legislation which has equal powers and rights to everyone? Now here, when the member of the NDA said about Article 14, and that equals are to be treated equally and unequals are to be treated equally, I agree that Article 14 is arbitrary in its nature, but neither any provision of the Constitution or any statute provides that there has to be misuse of this power of Article 14. Now, coming to what I basically want to talk about is the reorganization for a debtor. Now, the IBC provides a market mechanism for rescuing the failing but viable corporate debtors and liquidating failing and unviable ones. Now, I know this sounds a little confusing, so I will try to simplify this. So as we know, there is no precise formula, however, to identify which corporate debtor is a viable one or an unviable one, which basically gives the market a sense of wrong interpretation maybe. Now, let us take a very hypothetical situation. The market may wrongly classify a viable corporate debtor as an unviable one, and vice versa, because of market imperfection. Now, accordingly, it may happen that a rescue of an unviable corporate debtor has taken place close to that one of a viable one. Now, this entire is that pure flaw which I wanted to talk upon. Now, if there has been one particular corporate debtor, for example, who was viable, and the person would have been able to voluntarily or involuntarily, or there is a CIRP against him or going on, if this person genuinely deserves justice from the judiciary, but because it's been interpreted wrongly by the market mechanisms or market forces, it basically talks about justice delayed, justice denied. Now bringing back an getting it accordance to one of the speeches of one member of the government. Now, all I would like to say, Sir Chairman, is that it's highly important for us to start talking on talks which where we clearly differentiate between such places where there has been a lot of confusion which may be created, or where wrong or many interpretations may take place. Thank you so much.
Mir Fayaz.
Right. Thank you for the recognition, Chair. So I believe in one of the speeches, the leader of the House mentioned that the NCLT takes care of the operational creditors' rights and their interests, right? So if that is the basis for not including operational creditors in the limelight or in the committee of creditors, so tomorrow, if NCLT starts taking care of financial creditors' rights and its interests, would you just dissolve the committee of creditors? Because that is the ground on which you would be dissolving the presence of operational creditors in the group which leads that negotiations. Anyways, what actually concerns me is why is the leader of the House pushing so aggressively for against the operational creditors? Right, ultimately their money is also burnt up in this scenario, in this insolvency and bankruptcy scenario. So why is it so necessary that financial creditors only take a front seat and operational creditors do not? Right. With that done, I would like to point out to another concern which I was having regarding the present insolvency and bankruptcy code. That is, there are more than 3,000 cases pending under the IBC, under the various tribunals, respective tribunals, and IBBI. Now, and as I've proved that the haircut is too much, right? So objectively, the haircut is too much. Now, what I have seen in the market is that there is a syndicate forming, right? There are certain people, there are certain industries, certain industrialists who act as financial creditors, and at the same time they have their subsidiary companies which which work in insolvency resolutions. So what they do is they actually give you money, and now since creditors can move the courts for insolvency of they move the courts, and then they engage their own subsidiary companies which deal in resolution, insolvency and bankruptcy resolution processes. So this syndicate, we have to break, because this is not in the interest of a fair market. This prohibits the principles of a free market, and this gives a very unfair advantage to many people. It also beats the purpose of insolvency and bankruptcy code, with which it was created, right? It was created so that people who have their money stuck up in such scenarios, they get their money back and then they reinvest it in the economy. Thereby, the economy becomes viable. With that, I'd like to conclude my speech. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Gehlot sir.
Sir, Deputy Chairman, sorry for the interruption. Sir, it's a personal request to the Chairman. Sir, now because we're not ending the committee at 7, our itinerary basically changes for us to take a break. So if the executive board is okay, can we take a 10-minute break and reconvene at 4 p.m. sharp, so we can have 2 hours of, again, good undisrupted debate?
We can have our tea break early itself. Na? We have 30 minutes of tea break, I believe. So after Gehlot sir, if the committees of the consensus, we can have the tea break early.
Yeah, क्या नाम है ऋषिकेश?
हाँ sir.
Nothing is consensus here. Don't.
अच्छा, okay, sorry.
Okay, I am the king, and that is the most unfortunate thing for you all. तो ऐसा है कि देखो, with reference to the request कि मुझे भी ऐसा लग रहा था कि we had a very good discussion, and in a way that is very realistic in nature. I don't know how you felt about it, but I'm very happy how things are going. ठीक है ना? क्योंकि आइडियली देखो, बहुत सारे लोगों का ये भी कंसर्न रहते हैं कि पार्लियामेंट में अगर मुझे किसी से क्वेश्चन पूछना है तो हाउ एम आई सपोज टू डू इट, है ना? तो दिस इज हाउ यू आर सपोज टू डू इट, कि आप अपने क्वेश्चन को, अपने आर्ग्यूमेंट को, अपने काउंटर आर्ग्यूमेंट को अपने स्पीच में इंक्लूड करो. दैट इज द बेस्ट थिंग दैट यू कैन डू. अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट, जो तुम्हारा चैट बॉक्स है वो तुम्हें एक्चुअल पार्लियामेंट में तो नहीं मिलेगा. तो देयर आर अ वेज बाय व्हिच पार्लियामेंटेरियंस गेट इन टच विद ईच अदर इनफॉर्मली, बट नॉट थ्रू द चिट दैट इतना मैं आपको एश्योर करता हूँ. ठीक है ना? आप जैसे ऐसे ब्रेक्स होते हैं बेसिकली, टू मिस्टर जयराम रमेश, आई हम्बली रिक्वेस्ट यू कि what you can do कि क्योंकि we are अभी meeting and break for the break, right? break for a tea or coffee और जो भी आपको अच्छा लगता है, तो do one thing. ऋषिकेश, अभी किसकी स्पीच बची है?
गहलोत साहब की बची है, फिर
उसके बाद
we don't have anyone.
ठीक है, तो let गहलोत साहब have his floor. उसके बाद जयराम रमेश कैन, अब मैं बता देता हूँ उसका क्या प्रोसीजर है बेसिकली, क्योंकि आप लेजिस्लेटिव बिजनेस को डिसरप्ट कर रहे हो, राइट? एंड यू आर बेसिकली ट्राइंग टू इंट्रोड्यूस समथिंग एल्स व्हिच वाजंट अ पार्ट ऑफ द लेजिस्लेटिव बिजनेस और द लिस्ट ऑफ बिजनेस. मतलब ये जो छोटा सा बिक है बेसिकली, कि मतलब ऐसा नहीं कि दैट्स नॉट पॉसिबल, बट यू विल हैव टू बेग फॉर द लीव ऑफ द हाउस टू एडजॉर्न द मीटिंग एंड ब्रेक फॉर टी. जयराम रमेश, आर यू लिसनिंग टू मी?
Yes, I am.
तो अभी ऐसा है कि गहलोत साहब की स्पीच ले लेते हैं, तो उसके बाद यू विल हैव टू एडजॉर्न द मीटिंग एंड ब्रेक फॉर टी, है ना? तो मेंशन कर देना कितने मिनट के लिए, आधा घंटा, 45 मिनट, 1 घंटा. तो उसके बाद यू वुड ओनली रिक्वायर द सपोर्ट ऑफ 1/10 ऑफ द टोटल हाउस. दैट्स इट. ठीक है ना? बोलो
सर. आपसे बस एक ही रिक्वेस्ट है.
हाँ,
वो जो न्यूज़लेटर भेजा गया है ना सर,
हाँ,
वो सर आप थोड़ा प्लीज देखिए.
हाँ, मैं देख,
अगर हो सके तो प्लीज ऑल्सो फॉर द बेनिफिट ऑफ द कमिटी,
हाँ.
इफ यू कैन आस्क सर फयाज टू टेल अस सर वो आंकड़े कहाँ पे हैं.
मैं अभी पूछ लेता हूँ. वेयर इज सर फयाज? सर आंकड़े कहाँ हैं बता देना उनको, ठीक है?
न्यूज़लेटर पे है ना,
रिकन्वीन. हाँ प्लीज,
कहाँ है सर?
हाँ ठीक है ना, कहाँ है वो बता.
आई हैव रेड ऑल द 28 पेजेस सर. आपके आंकड़े मैं फिर से बता दे रहा हूँ फॉर द कमिटी टू बी.
एक मिनट गहलोत साहब, देखो अब वैसे भी आपकी स्पीच ही है और टाइमर स्टार्ट कर दो, आप एक्सप्लेन करो बढ़िया, ठीक है?
हाँ सर, ठीक है. थैंक यू सर. विद द ड्यू परमिशन ऑफ द चेयरमैन, माय अपॉलॉजीज. मीर फयाज जी का जो लॉजिक था कि एनसीएलटी हैज टू टेक केयर ऑफ ऑपरेशनल क्रेडिटर्स नाउ, एंड बाय दैट लॉजिक अगर कल को दे हैव टू आल्सो टेक केयर ऑफ फाइनेंशियल क्रेडिटर्स, देन द एंटायर कमिटी ऑफ क्रेडिटर्स शुड बी solemnly disbanded. That is not that's not a kind of a logic a parliamentarian should have. Please take into consideration कि 10% या उससे ज्यादा डेट अगर रहता है, then operational creditors also have a vote. कृपया करके सबसे हाथ जोड़ के हमारी विनती है कि आप जरा लॉ पढ़ लीजिए और आके कुछ भी कहने के लिए मत कीजिए. That's one. Secondly, please when you are speaking about the constitutionality of things, speak about the constitutionality of things and not give us as to why a certain logic seems right, because अगर आपकी logic सही चलती है तो आज आप सत्ता पे होते. समझने की कोशिश कीजिए. Now, I'm going to tackle again the real constitutionality issue. What I had spoken about in the last question is, why should an erstwhile manager not guilty of malfeasance or not guilty of acting contrary to the interest of the corporate debtor be barred from taking part in the resolution process? Now, I had already addressed this question. We now go over to the third issue, which is the disqualification of a person in management or control of a corporate debtor, which has remained as a non-performing asset for a year as per RBI guidelines and as per section 24 clause C of the IBC, my apologies, is unjustified and the period of 1 year is arbitrary. ये एक बड़ा concern है. To address to this, when you refer to clause 4 of the RBI master circular on prudential norms on income recognition, asset classification and provisioning pertaining to advances, the concept of 1 year arrived इसी RBI circular से. And NPA initially is classified as a substandard asset. ठीक है. The ineligibility of the said person in management or control of the corporate debtor, which has remained as an NPA attaches only after the 1 year period is over. 1 साल के बाद वो NPA then becomes a doubtful asset, क्योंकि हमको पता नहीं, पहले substandard इसलिए कहते हैं क्योंकि it's an inferior, there is erroneous way that the company or the corporate debtor has dealt with the certain asset. Doubtful हो जाता है क्योंकि हमें पता नहीं अब इसका क्या होने वाला है. The plausible reasoning behind the same is that the 1 year that is given ought to be considered as an opportunity to bring some positive changes to the stature of the credit worthiness of the debtor. क्योंकि अगर ये credit worthiness पे change नहीं आएगा, then it will finally get liquidated. The reason now I'm going to answer the question that was raised by Jairam Ramesh as to why liquidation नहीं कर देते हैं. Liquidation इसलिए नहीं करते initially, ma'am, because we want the company to have some opportunity to take care of itself. अगर आप liquidation कर दे रहे हो, then the entirety of the assets of the company is lost. The company is lost. So the person who would have otherwise done a lot of work to create the company, for example, and I'll wrap this up, and otherwise किसी छोटी सी गलती के लिए अपना loan repayment नहीं कर पा रहा है, then that opportunity is snatched from him, and hence we don't do it. Thank you.
Mr. We are done now.
ठीक है.